Beyonce just dropped her trailer for her new movie, Black is King. The internet went crazy, everyone was loving it, there was so much praise and adoration for it. But interestingly enough, there's been quite a number of people who are accusing Beyonce of cultural appropriation. Who would have thought? So on this channel, I've called out mostly white people for their part in cultural appropriation. So I only think it's right that I call out cultural appropriation when it's done within the black community, or at least when it's kind of discussed within the black community. I'm not saying that she is, I'm not saying that she isn't, but I'd like to discuss it and really see why people feel this way, particularly African people. So when I first watched the trailer, I had to watch it a few times like most people. I watched it a couple of times, and I have to admit, I wasn't a fan. Don't get me wrong, I love Beyonce. I think she deserves all her accolades. Everyone knows that she is the best at what she does. So I'm not in any way trying to come for her as an artist or anything like that. Let's get that out of the way first. So I actually spoke about this very briefly with a friend, Mezzy. If you haven't subscribed to her channel already, go ahead. I've noticed since like Lemonade, she uses a lot of African aesthetic, and she's become very Afrocentric in a way, and very openly pro-black. So a lot of people are kind of questioning, like, how can she be a cultural appropriator if she's black and all of that? I don't think it's as black and white as that. No pun intended. And you know what? I was glad when I saw this thread on Twitter of this Nigerian model. I think her name is Dimso or Dimsu, I'm not sure. But she had this thread on Twitter, and I kind of thought that people would mostly disagree with her, but people actually really agreed with what she was saying. Like, most African people agreed with what she was saying. Beyonce including African culture in her music, but never adding Africa to her tours. Same Beyonce making a whole movie based off Africa and its culture that's not available in Africa. I want to add that I'm not saying she has to come to Nigeria or whatnot. I'm saying she's contributing to the problematic ideologies of how Africa is viewed to line her own pockets. And Africa isn't even a country. She's mostly taking from Yoruba culture, so if you're gonna speak on something, come correct. Africa is not some prop. You can't come and pull from our culture from when it's convenient. That's appropriation. And not every time we were kings. Please, some of us were palm wine tappers. We don't wake up in the morning and tie a wrapper and put chalk on our face and scream, Wakanda, then go and hunt lions. We wake up and open Twitter like the rest of the world. Please stop pushing this old narrative, because it's the same black Americans, in an attempt to insult us, that will be asking if we have Wi-Fi and whether we live in huts and how we can afford iPhones. And that's the representation they see. Anytime someone talks about Africa, it's huts and lions, so I don't even blame them. And one more thing. Nobody's disputing that she has done a lot of good, but she's a human being and she's not above mistake, therefore not above critique. She has so tapped into that African queen mother thing that you people think everything she does is right. Black Americans always talking about, if a black person says it's appropriation, then shut up and listen. And now we, as African people, have come out to say that's appropriation, so please listen. I'm not gonna lie, I agree with her for the most part. Let me start by explaining my kind of perspective on this. As many people in the UK, I am a first generation Brit. So I have the ability to see how Africa is portrayed with a Western kind of view, or at least like what was shown from a Westernized point of view. But I also know what Africa really is, or at least I know what Nigeria is, because that's where my family comes from. So as a child, I was fortunate enough to go to Nigeria several times. I think the most recent time I went was about 2 years ago. I can see how Africa is portrayed. Maybe someone who's never been to Africa, doesn't know any African people, and then I can compare that to what I actually know it to be, because I have been there several times. I'm still in touch with my Nigerian relatives. So from a westernized kind of perspective, or at least if you've not really researched, or like, you know, you've gone out of your way to find out more, I feel like the perspective has been, at least when I was growing up, was that Africans always walking down some dirt path, half naked, with like chalk on their face. They live in dirt floor huts. There's all sorts of exotic animals roaming around the streets just freely, and that what else is there, like flies on children's faces and things like that. That's the sort of perspective that I would get if I didn't have my background of actually knowing what Africa was. But then now I'm kind of seeing from like the American kind of focus, as people are becoming more proud of their heritage. African Americans wanting to identify, well, some African Americans wanting to identify more with the African roots. You're seeing more of this like everybody in Africa are kings and queens or all royalty. Like everything is a deep spiritual thing. Like either you're a king or a queen or you're a witch doctor or, you know, things like that. And I'm seeing Beyonce kind of veering more towards like the African royalty and, you know, very like olden, traditional, outdated kind of perspective of what Africa is. People are having an issue with her not portraying like 21st century Africa. Like, this is a very outdated kind of perspective of what Africa is at the moment. And don't get me wrong, I think that it's great that she wants to be in touch with her African roots. I know there's definitely a sector of African Americans who want to veer more towards their African roots. And I've also seen the other perspective where a lot of African Americans fully just identify as being American, where their ancestors were enslaved and where they worked the land, they identify with being from that state. So I kind of see both perspectives, but anyway, let me not get off track. But I think that Africa has kind of become romanticized in a way that it's just like this Wakanda in a way that it's kind of, what's the right word I'm looking for? I get why people are so like encapsulated by what, you know, Wakanda is and the whole Black Panther movement. Like I love the Black Panther movie, but I think some people really think that some parts of Africa are like Wakanda. The thing is with Wakanda, they brought all different sorts of cultural significance, all sort of cultural heritage from all parts of Africa. So they brought parts from Nigeria, some from South Africa, from East Africa, and within one country it's very, very diverse. I can only speak for Nigeria, but there are many, many, many different ethnicities, languages, cultural backgrounds in Nigeria alone. So I don't know if that's really known on like a worldwide stage where it's like every single country is very diverse. We don't all share like, you know, we're not all like kumbaya and everyone is like a homogenous Africa. Not that we should be like divided, but I think that now it's kind of being portrayed as like Africa is this one big melting pot when it's not really. Everything has its own cultural significance. Like what one thing in one culture might be a sign of respect, in another culture it might be an insult or even like a curse. And I've kind of seen comments about people saying that, you know, we should be glad that Africa is even being represented by someone like Beyonce. I'm not gonna lie, I think out of everyone in the world, I think Africans have the most right to say how they want to be represented and how they want their own culture to be portrayed on a worldwide stage. And I don't think it's fair to shut down any sort of criticism or any sort of debate around what Beyonce is doing. Like, she's not God, she's not above criticism. Her work is there to be criticized. I don't know if anyone remembers when Drake came out starting to like dip his foot into different cultures. Like I remember when he did a collab with I believe it was like a Jamaican artist, and some Jamaicans had a problem with it. He dipped his foot into British kind of grime scene. He did work with Skepta, with Dave, and some people were not here for it. People were calling Drake a culture vulture. If you can understand why some people had a problem with Drake like coming and dipping his foot into different cultures and profiting off it, and even so far as to say that he was putting certain people on the map where they had a very strong base, it can be a bit insulting in that way. And it's also not Beyonce's job to represent Africa. Because she's at the position that she's at, I don't think it's fair to like say you must be true to your African roots and all that kind of stuff. However, she herself, she's put that onto her own image. She's put that on herself. She's chosen to be Mama Africa. She's chosen to be the Queen Mother of Africa, and even as so far as to be like an African goddess, she's channeled that definitely. Which even brings me to my next point. Her spirituality, or her identifying with traditionally West African and even more specifically Yoruba spirituality. I must be really late to the party because I didn't really know about this. I'll put my hands up and say I haven't really followed Beyonce that closely since her album 4. Everything leading up to album 4, I was really into Beyonce. I've rinsed all her albums out, like B-Day especially, I Am Sasha Fierce, all of that. After album 4, I dropped off a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. To this day, I haven't listened to the whole of Lemonade or watched the visual album. I will get around to it, I keep saying. So yeah, I didn't realise how deep she was into Yoruba spirituality, and I don't know if it's even like well documented or well known that she is. Again, I could be very late to the party. I don't know if this is like a known thing. Even before this all came out, before the trailer even dropped for Black is King, I was listening to this podcast on Spotify. It's called Dissect, where they basically break down all different albums. It's very like in-depth, and yeah, it's really good. I listened to the Lemonade one and I was like, they're referencing like all the orishas, like Oshun, and traditional Yoruba kind of spiritual imagery, and I was like, what? I had no idea. Like, and I think the song Hold Up, she was basically channeling Oshun. If anyone doesn't know, Oshun is one of the most powerful Yoruba goddesses. She represents fertility, love, sensuality, as well as vanity, jealousy, and spite. So she's one of the most well-known orishas in Yoruba spirituality. So in the Hold Up video, I kind of looked at it again and I was like, like, oh, like Beyonce's fully like embodied Oshun, even at the Grammys performance. It just clicked. Then I also saw in like a song Black Parade, yeah, her newest song Black Parade, she made reference to Solange basically channeling the spirit of Yemoja, or I think in like South American culture she's known as Yemaya. Very quickly, the Yoruba religion, as slaves were taken to the Caribbean and the Americas, the Yoruba religion kind of went with them, and it's still present to this day in a lot of South American spirituality. So Yemoja is kind of represents like an ocean goddess. People like to call her Mami Wata, that's a different story with them. And a lot of people are having issue with her showing traditional Yoruba spirituality in her videos. A lot of people are calling it evil, demonic, and all things like that. I don't know anything about that. So here's my opinion on that. So as someone who is from Yoruba descent, I kind of grew up knowing about some of like traditional Yoruba spirituality and the gods and goddesses like that. It wasn't like a big deal in my household. It was just like, oh, here's like an olden story of so and so. Like some of the goddesses like Oya or Shun being the most famous one. So I'm now trying to imagine, as African Americans who want to be in touch with the African side, I can kind of see how I might take that for granted, that I know my ancestry and I know like olden time stories that have been passed down and stuff like that. So I don't think it's a bad thing to know about these different stories and this different like folklore. I see there's this massive stigma with wanting to know your traditional African spirituality and the traditional religious background. Now, as a Christian, I would never put anything above my God or Jesus. That is my faith, so I would never put anything above that. But as a Nigerian, I also think it's important to know your cultural background. You will never say to, for example, an Indian who happens to be a Christian, why they shouldn't know about traditional Hindu gods. Even in school, I learned about all these different Hindu gods and goddesses. I never saw anyone calling traditional Hindu gods evil. Greek mythology, Venus, Aphrodite, Zeus, all of that. We learn about all the different Greek gods and goddesses. It's never been called evil. I think with Yoruba being one of the biggest ethnic groups in Africa, and it's even gone around to South America and parts of America, why should they not be taught it? Why shouldn't African Americans be taught like this is what was traditionally taught? However, when it comes to spirituality, there's been all sorts of accusations about Beyonce being some kind of witch, or even as far as like a high priestess in certain things. I don't know about that. I'm not giving my opinion on that. The group that she kind of put on, Chloe and Halle, they released an album called Ungodly Hour. Again, I don't know about that. Her saying in the video, the ancestors never left you, things like that. One thing about ancestors, not all of them are good. Not all of them are worth disturbing. I mean, I don't believe in connecting with the dead anyway, but some ancestors are best just left alone. Again, it just comes down to like romanticizing certain things that some people might not have cultural understanding of, so you might not see certain things as rituals because you don't know. So I don't want it to be the sort of thing where certain things that are very serious in Yoruba culture are just taken as like, oh, like I just want to be African, Afrocentric, when no, you're getting into some real stuff. I feel like I was rambling here and there. I don't know if that made sense. Hopefully it does. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and you like this video. So moving on to my last point. This this movie is basically seen to be reconnecting with your African roots and things like that. So she uses a lot of African imagery, a lot of African dances, hairstyles, and it's being broadcast on Disney Plus. But Disney Plus is not available in any African countries. Like, none. People trying to say, be grateful that Beyonce's doing this for Africa. In my head, she's not doing it for Africa. She's doing it for African Americans, for them to have an idea of their African roots. This is not, in my opinion, this is not for Africans. This is not her trying to do Africans a service. It's for African Americans and for the rest of the world. Like, again, Africa is left to be like forgotten, or it's like whatever. This also brings to the point that she doesn't really tour in Africa. Her and Jay-Z don't tour in Africa. I think it was On the Run 1, 2, the Formation Tour, the Mrs. Carter World Tour. She did not tour any part of Africa. I know she's done a couple of shows in South Africa. One of them I know being for Mandela. Another thing, I don't want to count charity gigs as touring Africa. Like, I don't like that perspective of, okay, let's sprinkle a bit of charity on Africa with doing a couple shows. No, it's not the same. The production's not the same. It's for a different thing. It's not supposed to be a focus on Beyonce. It's supposed to be a focus on the charity, okay? So let's forget that. And even the On the Run tour, the inspiration for On the Run, I think a lot of people think it's from Bonnie and Clyde because she had that song with Jay-Z. They actually based it on a classic Senegalese story. It's based on Tuki and Buki. It was based on two young lovers. She can use all this African imagery, African art. I know she put a lot of African artists on her album for The Lion King. I don't see where the reciprocity is. And you see artists coming to Nigeria and Ghana all the time, especially at Christmas. I think within the last few years, a lot of Americans come down to Nigeria and Ghana, waving their Nigerian and Ghanaian flags and saying, oh, how much we love Africa. And you know, if it's good enough for you to visit and to see different concerts there, why can't you come over and perform? I know a few artists have come to there to perform, which isn't as publicised. Migos was there a couple of years ago. They actually filmed a music video in Nigeria, but they kind of just filmed it as is, like just 21st century Nigeria. It wasn't like a massive production. And they did a couple shows there. Simple. They performed with Davido in Nigeria a few times. So I don't like this perception of things not working in Africa. If Black Panther's shown you anything, is that how many years are people saying that no one wants to see a movie cast with just all black people, that it would never work, it would never sell. It ended up being, what, the highest grossing movie of the year. So I think we need to let go of these old perceptions of African tours will never sell out or things like that, because have you even tried? And again, no one's begging her to come to Nigeria or come to any African cities. And no one come on saying about South Africa, because every single artist likes to come to South Africa. But, you know, there's 54 countries in Africa. It's not every day just South Africa, okay? And then even within South Africa, it's just Joburg that they go to. So again, that just really reinforces how I believe this project is not for Africans. Not that she said it is for Africans, but I don't want people to be deceived into thinking that she's doing this for Africa. But no, she's doing this for African Americans, because there's a massive black movement going on. I also will say, I don't think that she like strategically kind of did this with the Black Lives Matter movement. She's had this production going on, I think, for like a year or two. So it just so happens that this Black Lives Matter movement's going on. She might not have initially planned to release it, you know, in the month of July, maybe like further on in the year, I don't know. But she did have this production going on for a while. It's just a coincidence that Black Lives Matter movement is making this more profound. I really just want to hammer home the point of Africans having the right to critique and criticize Beyonce for this production. If you're using imagery from a particular nation, I think they have every right to be somewhat critical. I don't care who you are. Like, Beyonce is not above reproach, I'm sorry. It would be nice to have representation of, you know, not just very, very poor Africa and then, like, you know, olden time kings and queens. I've been to the villages in parts of Nigeria. I've been to like the slave ports. I've also been in the presence of a king before. I've also been in the middle, but it's mostly in the middle. like that's that Nigeria that I experience. I will say an artist that does a great job of this is Burna Boy. If you check out all his music videos, I think he displays Nigeria in all sorts of different ways that are relevant. Very much looking forward to see what this movie is and what comes from it. And I might come out with another video like reviewing the movie in its totality. Some of us don't have Disney Plus, so we're gonna have to get creative. I hope you like this video, guys. Make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.